The sun was shining brightly as Thaddeus stepped outside into the street. This lifted his heart as he took in a few deep breaths. He had sat on his bed that morning thinking hard on his next course of action. He had decided he must take a stand. His conscience demanded it. The outsider walked to the top of the street where most of the people were gathered for market. Several goblins hung back in the shadows as if waiting for an opportunity to steal something. Our man climbed on top of a large wooden box and spoke in a deep and commanding voice. "Hear me, good people of Valnapopia. I am but an outsider, new to this land, but already I have learned of the bondage you suffer under cruel King Oswald and his tyrannical regime. Just yesterday I saw his son Reginald commit a most foul and despicable murder in this very street, with complete impunity. In the name of all that is good and holy I say unto you, this will not stand." As Thaddeus continued, more folks emerged from their dwellings and gathered around the speaker. Some faces looked anxiously around, perhaps half expecting to catch the eye of one of the king's spies. Other folks, closer to the rousing speaker, started to cheer. Some began to chant such things as "Down with Oswald," or "Death to Reginald, the bastard coward." Thaddeus asked the people of Valnapopia to join him in bringing down the crown. He reminded his audience that nothing compared to the sweet breath of freedom, and that death was preferable to slavery, as was almost customary with rousing speeches of this kind. Starting at the front and working its way through the whole crowd came the chant, "Down with the crown." Thaddeus had been surprised that not one person objected to his words or had called him out for being a foreigner. As he took in the scene, his belief grew that fate had him exactly where she intended him to be. The noise of the people then stopped abruptly as all heads turned and looked to the bottom of the street. The crowd parted as if moved by an unseen and irresistible force. Now Thaddeus could see the monster stood there with his fists clenched. The beast fixed his eyes on the former speaker and walked slowly and methodically towards him. To say the stranger was overmatched would be a significant understatement. Surely he could not fight and hope to slay this freak. The kindly innkeeper had told him of the carnage left behind the last time the giant had come to market to deal with a rabble-rouser. A messy scene it was. All of a sudden, and with seemingly impossible speed, the giant made a hop and a skip, shaking the ground, before reaching out and seizing Thaddeus by the head. He lifted him high into the air and brought him to eye level, as to inspect his prey. Quite unexpectedly, a goblin, possessed by God knows what, now took this opportunity to jump from a nearby rooftop onto the giant's back. The ugly little green creature then furiously stabbed away at the monster's neck and right shoulder with its dagger, while screaming, "Die, die, die." The giant dropped Thaddeus and forced his attention on the goblin. Feeling around with both hands, he managed to grab a foot and pull the thing off of him. With merely the use of his thumb and index finger, he squeezed the goblin's neck. Almost immediately, the creature's head popped off, causing a fountain of blood to spurt all over an old wench stood too close. The goblin's head landed in Thaddeus's lap as he sat where the giant had dropped him. The woman, who had been drenched in goblin blood, now found the courage to speak up. She screeched in a vindictive tone, "Foul beast! A curse on you and your house, filthy abomination!" The giant laughed, with a belly roar, as the people cowered in terror. Thaddeus had by now gotten to his feet and taken a few steps back. Still the giant laughed, his great big gob hanging open for all the world to see and smell. As the beast turned back towards Thaddeus, our man spun around violently 3 times and launched the object upwards towards the intended target. The goblin's head flew straight down the back of the giant's throat, causing him to gag and then choke. He stumbled about, knocking down several market stalls as he did. With a look of desperation in his eyes, the giant collapsed and expired. What a shock! The people danced and cheered, as did the goblins and fairies. This was not some fortuitous victory. This was a sign. Deep magic was at work, and the forces that be were turning against the king and his court. A couple of drunken bumpkins raised Thaddeus up on their shoulders, as if to present the people's champion to the excited crowd, who now chanted his name. Thaddeus felt like a man possessed. He also felt like an ale or two. The Queen sat alone in her chambers, awaiting the arrival of her older sister Olivia, the Witch of the Eastern Sea. The royal gazed at her crown, which was in front of her on the bronze table. Her thoughts were with her children. They had become a great disappointment to her. She knew she was partly to blame, of course, but she reserved a special resentment for Oswald, with whom she no longer shared a bed. Arabella, the Queen, knew that things could not go on the way they were. She could not go on. The palace was full of indulgers, retainers, and foul creatures held in the service of their brutal lord. Arabella suspected that some of her husband's favourite witches had put a curse on her, or perhaps it was his wizards, but Olivia assured her younger sibling that she was under the protection of her magic. The king had never liked the Witch of the Eastern Sea, and would have surely done away with her if not for his wife's soothing words. Olivia arrived later than expected and was quick to explain she was held up in the main hall by those who had gathered there. A royal spy had returned to inform his master of the giant's demise at the hands of Thaddeus the Brave. The Queen's chambers were on the 3rd floor of the palace, so she hadn't heard all the noise and commotion which had followed the news. Oswald had flown into an epic rage and had dispatched most of his best fighting men to go forth and bring him the head of this dog who dared to challenge his power. Olivia retold the story as she had heard it from the spy, and as she did, Arabella became more and more excited. Who was this stranger who had set the kingdom aflame? Was he heading here, right this very moment, with the intention of slaying Oswald? Olivia suggested that her sister might seriously consider leaving, but the Queen rebuffed her. She had to stay with her children. They were what mattered most. It was then that her sister informed her that Reginald had gone out with the fighting force to confront and kill the rabble and the Rouser. The Queen fell silent. After some time had passed, she merely said, "Whatever the will of the gods, let it be." It was then that the doors flew open, and in came rushing the princess with tears running down her cheeks. She came into the arms of her mother, who held her tightly and kissed her on the head. Maria had not the maturity nor the courage to process and deal with these events. She just wanted to be held and protected. This surely Arabella could do for her daughter. Olivia left this scene after kissing both her sister and niece. She proceeded back down the spiral stone staircase and into the main hall. The king, she could see, was not on his throne. He was slumped in the corner. Rage had given way to something else. But what she did not know, he was attended only by a single slag. At the huge oak table witches and wizards argued with each other, as if bickering like children. One ugly giant is sent to meet his maker, and the whole kingdom is falling apart, thought Olivia. She didn't want to be seen by Oswald, so she didn't linger in the hall. The elder sister of Arabella had a mind to go and visit the purple witch in the southern forest. Perhaps the old hag would have some sage words for her. Thaddeus and his band of increasingly merry and drunken men were heading for Oswald's palace. They had placed their hands on whatever weapons they could come by, clubs, bats, pots, pans, etc., and had filled their bellies before saying goodbye to the womenfolk. One kind wench had given the people's champion a good-luck charm before they departed. They were true believers now. Thaddeus the Brave had convinced them that the hand of fate was with them. As the palace came within sight, on the horizon, a large group of heavily armed men emerged from the forest, some on foot, others on horseback. It was Reginald and the king's men. Both groups sized each other up. The commoner's army was outnumbered by the royal force at least 2 to 1. The prince sat atop of his black stallion, chuckled at the sight of these peasants and bumpkins with their pitiful weaponry. He declared that all the commoners would be spared and pardoned if they lay down their arms and walked away from the battlefield. The only thing Reginald wanted was the head of Thaddeus. The commoners' army stood firm, with one among them telling his Royal Highness to eat shit and die. And so a bloody fight between both sides seemed inevitable. However, Lady Fate had something else in mind. From the trees behind the royal forces came forth the most beautiful creature that any man there had ever seen. What were these otherworldly beings? For now there was more than one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They were dressed in almost blindingly bright white silk, and all had long hair of spun gold. They proceeded to undress themselves and the royal forces. Now there were more of them, 10, 20, 50. They undressed all the men, except for Reginald. The men of the king's command, as if bewitched, indulged in lustful abandon with these creatures for all the world to see. This libidinous behaviour spooked the horses, who now ran in all directions. Reginald's own stallion bucked and threw the prince to the ground before striding away from the licentious scene. The prince ordered the men to stop what they were doing on pain of death, but his words fell on deaf ears. An old man from among Thaddeus's men told his brothers that these beings were in fact elves. They were rarely seen in this kingdom or any other, but when they did appear it was a sign of big changes to come. His words penetrated the minds of his comrades as they stood watching the king's men penetrate these enchanting beauties. Reginald stood close, watching this with disbelief. He would not have been able to remove his gaze from this orgy, if not for the realization that Thaddeus the Brave was stood right behind him, breathing hard and heavy. "Turn and face me, coward," said the leader of the commoners in an authoritative fashion. As the prince turned to face his enemy, he remembered the words of the purple witch. This suddenly filled his cruel heart with confidence. he could see that Thaddeus was without a sword or shield. "Who is this fool who would challenge me without blade in hand?" thought the evil heir to the throne. He drew his sword and raised it high above his head, as if to bring a terrible blow down on the outsider. Thaddeus, with lightning quickness, pulled his lucky charm from his pocket, a dragon's tooth no less, and sliced the prince's belly wide open, disemboweling him. Reginald dropped his sword to the ground and fell to his knees. In a panic he tried to cram his guts back in, but with no success. None of this gruesomeness was given even the slightest bit of attention by the elves, or the enraptured men who continued their sexual congress. The wicked prince then expired, and Thaddeus held up the lucky dragon's claw to his men, who he expected to cheer but did not, for they were still watching the elves go to work. The people's champion cleared his throat several times very loudly, eventually getting the attention of his followers. "To the palace, brave men of Valnapopia! Down with the tyrant! We come for you, Oswald." Our man's words once more roused the spirit of freedom and justice. The commoner's army was on the march again. Olivia, sister of Queen Arabella, had almost reached the home of the Purple Witch, when she was stopped by a talking raven who introduced himself as Cyril the Savage, Lord of the Southern Forest. Olivia thought the bird quite ridiculous, and motioned that he move away from her. Cyril did not take kindly to Olivia's dismissive attitude, and stated that he would peck out her green eyes unless she get down on her knees and recognize his standing. With this, the Witch of the Eastern Sea spoke some words in the old tongue, and snapped her fingers. The bird fell from the branch stone dead. She picked up Cyril's corpse and took it to the door of the Purple One. The ugly old woman seemed pleased to see Olivia. The two had not spoken in a while. Many moons ago Olivia had been a student of the Purple One, and a promising one at that. The witches sat smoking herbs and reminiscing about old times for a little while, before Olivia was given a stark warning. She must leave Valnapopia now, for her life was in grave danger. She must not try to save her sister, as she was surely doomed. The Queen's sister did not have the power to see the future as the old hag did. She was not sure whether to believe her former teacher or not. The Purple One was also known for her occasional deceptions. The ugly hag told the Queen's sister to keep heading south, all the way to the neighbouring kingdom of Muddy Spunk, which was actually a lot nicer than it sounded. Olivia chose not to heed the Purple Witch's advice, and instead headed back north, with the intention of returning to Oswald's palace to save her sister and her niece. The Witch of the Eastern Sea had hoped that the old hag would have offered her better news, but it wasn't to be. Olivia would never again leave the southern forest. She had not gotten 100 steps from the Purple Witch's dwelling when she was set upon by 13 ravens and pecked into bloody pieces by the terrible birds. Cyril's brothers took their vicious revenge, battening on the witch's flesh and blood. The largest among them, Boris, ate her delicious green eyes. What a treat! Thaddeus and the commoner's army arrived at Oswald's palace, with the blood burning in their veins. But the passion soon simmered down when they could see that the drawbridge was up. The men circled the site to see a way in, but could see none. What were they to do now? They turned to their leader with this question. The stranger they had chosen to follow was swift with his tongue. He said, "We will enter when God wills it, and not a moment before." The men looked at each other, some rolling their eyes, others shrugging their shoulders. Then all of the men sat down on the long grass, as if to make camp, all except Thaddeus, who remained standing. His eyes turned to the sky, as if he were in some personal conversation with the Almighty. Inside the palace, the king had called his most trusted wizard aside, and asked him what should his next move be. What the wizard suggested disturbed his majesty greatly. Oswald then put the question to all of his wizards and witches. There was no absolute agreement, but most seemed to be siding with the king's most trusted, and so Oswald sent this old sorcerer down to the entrance of the forbidden dungeon, which had not been opened since the reign of the last king, Tarquin the Queer. The old magician stood at the foot of the dungeon and gathered himself. He knew, as did all sorcerers in this kingdom, that this place could only be opened with a special incantation. He spoke the words, "Forces of old, ancient powers of the earth, send us your foul sons, so that we bask in the misery and screams of those who would do us harm." With this, the heavy iron gate opened without making a sound. The wizard peered into the darkness. At first, nothing seemed to be happening. Then began the dull moans and growls from within.